Hi, welcome to our channel. Enjoy our audiobooks and please subscribe, like, and thumbs up for more audiobooks. Thanks for watching.
Childtimes, a three-generation memoir by Eloise Greenfield and Leslie Jones Little, with material by Patty, Radley and Jones, drawings by Jerry Pinkney and photographs from the author's family albums. Part 1. Patty Frances Ridley Jones. It's been a good long time since my child time. Yours is now, you reliving your child time right this minute, but I've got to go way back to remember mine. Memory is a funny thing. You never know how it's going to act. A lot of things that I saw and heard about when I was a girl, I can't call to mind at all now. My memory just skips right over them. Some other things I can almost remember, but when I try to catch hold of them, they get mixed up with something else or disappear. But then, there are the things that keep coming back just as plain, just as clear. About my mother's mother. Mary Eliza Barnes would one day be my grandmama, but when she was young, she was held a slave in Bertie County, a large farming area in North Carolina. She told my mama about it when mama was a little girl, and mama told me. I don't know grandmama's real last name. She wasn't allowed to use it. Slaves had to go by the name that the white family had, the family that the law said owned them, and grandmama was held by the Barnes family. They made her work out in the fields all day, every day. Sick or well, good weather or bad, she had to work. And after slavery was over, she kept on working in those same fields for a little bit of pay and a place to live. She didn't know any other way to make a living, and she stayed there for a good while. Some of Grandmama's children were born on that farm. One of them was named Martha Ann, the dumb supper. When Martha Ann Barnes was a little girl, some new neighbors moved to Bertie County. They were the Ridleys from over in Oxford, North Carolina. Robert Franklin Ridley and his wife, Maria, and their two daughters, Harriet and Kitty. Those two little girls and Martha got to be the best of friends, and they played together every chance they got. Martha couldn't play as much as she wanted to because she wasn't free. Slavery was over and she wasn't a slave, but she wasn't free, either. She had to be a maid for the Barnes family. But every minute she could, she spent at the Ridleys'. She even got to calling Mr. and Mrs. Ridley Uncle Bob and Aunt Maria. One day, the girls decided to play a game called Dumb Supper. It was a game to see who you would marry. Harriet and Kitty and Martha all sat around the dinner table with their plates turned down, and nobody was talking. They weren't supposed to talk, and the kitchen window had been raised so that, by some kind of magic, a man would come through the window and turn up the plate of the girl he would marry. Uncle Bob was sitting there watching them, and they were all quiet and waiting for something to happen, when all of a sudden, a strong wind came up. And while that wind was blowing, it thundered, the loudest thunder they had ever heard, and a big dog that nobody had ever seen before jumped through the window. Well, Uncle Bob stood up and told them to cut out that dumb supper. And that was the end of that. Mr. Ridley. When Martha was 15 years old, after Aunt Maria had been dead for some years, she and Uncle Bob fell in love and wanted to get married. Martha's mother was good and mad with her for wanting to marry a man old enough to be her father. But things were different in those days. Back then, most girls thought the only thing they could do when they grew up was get married and take care of the house, and raise a family. So, Martha kept on worrying her mother about it. After a while, her mother told her to go ahead and get married, if that was what she wanted to do. So Martha Ann Barnes and Robert Franklin Ridley got married, but she got so much teasing from the people around there for calling her husband Uncle Bob that she didn't want to call him that anymore. She started calling him Mr. Ridley. Only she said it fast, like one word, Miss Ridley. And she called him that as long as he lived. Well, they were my mama and papa, and they had 5 children. John, then me, then Leah, Marie, and Maddie. We never did see our half-sisters, Harriet and Kitty. They had stayed with Mama and Papa for a time, but Harriet was taken sick with TB and died, and Kitty went back to Oxford and got married. We did see Kitty's picture, though. Mama kept it put away in her trunk, and we children called the picture Sis Kitty. We loved Harriet and Kitty, even if we didn't really know them. We heard a lot about them from Mama and Papa, all about them being Mama's best friends and about the dumb supper. And we never did find out what happened to that big dog, because of every time they got to the part about Papa jumping up and saying, "Stop this dumb supper," we'd fall all over the place, just laughing. Parmalee, North Carolina. Towns build up around work, you know. People go and live where they can find jobs. And that's how Parmalee got started. At first, it was just a junction, a place where two railroads crossed. Two Atlantic Coastline railroads, one running between Rocky Mount and Plymouth, and one running between Kinston and Weldon. Didn't too many people jive around there then, and those that did were pretty much spread out. Well, around 1888, a Yankee named Mr. Parmalee came down from New York and looked the place over, and he saw all those big trees and decided to start a lumber company. Everybody knew what that meant. There were going to be jobs. People came from everywhere to get work. I was right little at that time, too little to know what was going on, but everybody says it was something to see how fast that town grew. All those people moving in and houses going up. They named the town after the man who made the jobs, and they called it Parma-E. The lumber company hired a whole lot of people. They hired workers to lay track for those little railroads they call tram roads that they were going to run back and forth between the town and the woods. They hired lumberjacks to chop the trees down and cut them up into logs and load them on the tram cars. They hired men to build the mill and put the machinery in, and mill workers to run the machines that would cut the logs into different sizes and dry them nice and smooth. That wood was some kind of pretty when it was finished, too. Some of it was sold in our town to people who had the money to buy ceilings for their houses, but most of it was sold in our town to people who had the money to buy ceilings for their houses, but most of it was shipped to other places. Mr. Parmalee made a whole lot of money. Not too many people liked him, not too many white people, anyway. He made a whole lot of money, though. He had so many people working for him that he had this special store built just for them, a commissary, where they could buy what they needed, groceries, and medicine, and shoes, and yard goods, just about anything they needed. He had houses built too, two-story houses. Right goes to the commissary. They built houses for the white workers and their families, and they painted them white. And out a ways from there, he had some more houses built, 10 of them, but he didn't have chose painted. They were for the black workers, and 20 families had to live in those 10 houses. That was the part of Parmalee they called Sugar Hill. Well, after a good many years, about 18, I guess the mill had to be closed down. Just about all of those great big trees were gone. Mr. Parmalee moved his lumber mill away to South Carolina, if I remember right, and that didn't leave too many jobs in our town. A lot of people left, a lot of people. They moved to other places, looking for work. Papa's jobs. We were living in a little place called Robersonville, about 3 miles from Parmalee, when Papa heard about the mill going up. He had been down sick with a bad case of rheumatism around that time, and Mama and all of us had been real worried about him, but he was better by then and walking on crutches. So early one morning he took the train to go see about getting a job. They hired Papa, and that's when we moved to Parmalee. Papa got 75 cents a day for feeding the horses that pulled the wagon loads of machine saws and things from the train station to the mill. And when all the machinery was in, he got the job of cooking at the clubhouse where the company's officers lived, and cleaning up their bedrooms and the dining room. The clubhouse was different from most all the houses around Parmalee. It had radiators and pipes running from the mill for steam heat in the winter time. There was even a bathtub. It was in the dining room, and pipes for hot and cold running water, and hardly anybody had that in their houses. Papa worked at the clubhouse until the mill closed down, and then he stayed on as the night watchman. After all the machines had been taken out and shipped away, Papa spent his nights there, watching those empty buildings. Mr. John Draper. Everybody around Parmalee knew Mr. John Draper, and everybody liked him, too. He waited on people in the commissary, and he was just as nice as he could be. People would come in with their wooden baskets over their arms, and Mr. John Draper would get them what they wanted and pack it in the baskets so nice and neat. He sold things door to door, too. All kinds of sweet things like cakes and donuts. He had a basket just full of good things, but he didn't carry it over his arm. Didn't even have to hold it. Walked right along steady with it the way his ancestors had done in Africa. I used it's going to spill, and all those goodies are going to be lying out in the road. But it never did. One time, Mr. John Draper gave a big festival. That was after I got to be a pretty big girl. He hadn't gotten married yet at that time, and he was living by himself upstairs over an empty store building. Well, he set up tables on the first floor and put refreshments on all the tables, and he asked Mr. Stanley Barnhill to come from Bethel to sing. People from all over came to that festival. They came from neighboring towns and from all out in the country, and everywhere. Mr. Stanley Barnhill sang, "Traveling, I've got on my traveling shoes," and I got in line with my fella like all the other young girls, and we marched. We couldn't dance, dancing was a sin. But we marched, I'm telling you. We marched around and around that room until we got too tired to take another step. Then we went up to the tables, and our fellas treated us to punch and little cakes. We had the best old time, and I kept thinking it sure was nice of Mr. John Draper to do this for us. Our house. Papa built our house. It was shaped like a capital L lying down on its side. Well, no, to tell you the truth, it was more like 3 L's sandwiched together, the back porch, and the front porch, and the house in the middle. It was made of wood mostly, but right at the corner of the front bedroom, there was a big brick chimney that started on the ground and went way up to taller than the house. We had 3 rooms and a hall and a kitchen. One of the front rooms was Mama and Papa's, and the other one was my brother John's. We girls had the back room. I can remember that Papa painted one of the rooms blue, a soft kind of blue, but I can't for the life of me remembers which room it was. The kitchen was the place where Mama and Papa liked to sit in the evening after Papa got off from work. I remember one time Papa came home with a piece of wood for my youngest sister, Maddie. It was a short plank from the mill. Maddie was really little then, and he always brought her something, a stick of candy or some little something, and this time he brought her this plank. Well, Maddie was so happy. When Mama and Papa sat in the kitchen that night, she rested the ends of the plank on the rounds of their chairs and then sat on it, and she just sat there looking back and forth from one to the other while they talked. I liked to be inside the house most of the time doing quiet kinds of things. Reading and learning poems. I liked to play Sunday school with my little sisters when I could keep them still long enough. They'd let me teach them Bible lessons for a little while, but not for long. First thing I'd know, they'd dash for the door and there they'd be for the rest of the day, Marie, Maddie, and Leah, running and playing in the yard. We had a nice big backyard with all kinds of flowers that Mama had planted, just about every kind of flower you can think of, and then a fence that went all the way around the house. Outside the fence, there was a ditch for the water to drain into when it rained. And then our garden, a big vegetable garden with collards and cucumbers and sweet potatoes and butter beans, all kinds of things. When Mary and Leah got to be pretty big girls, they planted 4 trees, elm trees, in the front yard. After a while, Mama cut 2 of them down, but the other 2 grew up so full and pretty. Our house is gone now. It's been gone right many years, but one of those trees is standing there yet. Water. We didn't have running water. At first, we had a well out in the backyard, until it started caving in and Papa had to get rid of it. He filled it in with dirt. Then every time we wanted water for bathing or drinking or washing clothes, we had to go get water from a neighbor's pump. We got so tired of carrying those buckets of water, and we were some kind of glad when Papa finally put a pump on our back porch. Maddie's ride. We had a horse named George, and one day when Papa was going to Robersonville or somewhere on business, he hitched George to the buggy and went back in the house to get something. Well, my little sister Maddie got in the buggy. She and Lillian, her friend Lottie, Belle's sister, and they picked up the reins, and George started right off walking down the road. Such screaming and yelling you never heard. And poor Papa, he had to run down there and catch them. More about my mother's mother. I had never laid eyes on Grandmama to remember when Mama and Papa said we could go on a trip to visit her. They said we were big enough to go by ourselves, all except Maddie. She was too little. My brother was the biggest, he was about 12 then, and he was put in charge of the rest of us. Grandmama lived on a big farm in a place called Sea Landing, and we would have to take a train and a boat to get there. Mama packed our clothes and she and Papa took us to the train station. Mama kept saying, "Don't forget to do this, and don't forget to do that," and I was saying, yes ma'am, but I was in a hurry for that train to get moving. Well, it finally did, and we were on our way. We got off the train in Williamston and got in a hack. That's what they used to call cabs, only back then a cab wasn't a car, there weren't any cars on the streets. The hack was a horse and carriage, and we climbed up in it and told the driver to take us to Mrs. Rhodes' house. And that's where we spent the night. Real early the next morning, about 5 o'clock, Mrs. Rhodes took us down to the dock, and there was the boat, the Haven Belle. It was a funny-looking little thing, kind of like a wooden house, with a narrow walkway going all the way around and windows all around, too. We went inside and sat down on some long benches, and we sat there all the way, looking out the window at the water. When we got to Sea Landing, Mama's brother, Uncle Redden, met us and took us to Grandmama's, and she was so happy to see us. She just hugged us and kissed us, and the whole time we were there, she was cooking us good things to eat and doing everything to let us have a good time. Every morning after breakfast, she would tell us to go out to the plum trees and eat all we wanted. She had a whole lot of plum trees, and those leaves were so thick and close together that just a few tiny dots of sunlight could get through. We'd sit on the grass under the trees and eat until our stomachs almost popped. One day Grandmama made us some molasses pudding, and we had always loved molasses pudding. Dark brown and kind of moist, like gingerbread. We held out our plates while Grandmama cut a big piece for each one of us. We said, "Thank you, ma'am," and went out under the trees to eat it. But when we tasted it, it wasn't like the kind Mama made. It wasn't like the kind Mama made. It wasn't made with flour, it was made with cornmeal. Well, I tell you, it was some kind of bad tasting, but we didn't want to hurt Grandmama's feelings, so we went way out away from the house and threw that molasses pudding as far as we could. And when Grandmama asked us if we liked it, we said, "Yes, ma'am." After a while, our visit was over, and we took the Haven Belle back to Williamston and the train back to the Parmalee station. Mama and Papa were waiting for us, and we all talked at the same time, telling about what a good time we had. When Grandmama got old, Uncle Redden wanted her to come live with him, but she didn't want to live with any of her children. She wanted to live by herself. So Uncle Redden built a house for her in his yard, and every morning he would send one of his boys to look in on her, to be sure she was all right. One morning, when the boy got there, Grandmama had died. We were so sad when we got the news. Mama packed some of her clothes and took the train to go to the funeral. But not many people had telephones back then, and the news had come late. By the time Mama got to the cemetery, they were lowering the casket into the grave, and they had to bring it back up so Mama could get one last look at her mother. Then Uncle Redden took sick. He took sick right there at the burial, and he didn't live but a few more days. It was a real sad time for all of us. Clothes. Mama made our dresses. Maddie's, Marie's, Leah's, and mine. Papa used to buy a whole bolt of cloth, and all of us would have a dress made out of that same material. We thought we were really something in those dresses. Long-sleeved dresses with yokes. The bottom part was gathered on the yoke and hung down loose to just below the knee. We wore sailor hats with streamers and bows, and high-topped shoes and heavy-ribbed stockings up to the knee. We'd put these wide rubber bands, about an inch wide, around the tops of our stockings to keep them from falling down. Mama made us take good care of our clothes, too. We'd better not get them messed up. She'd say, "Your papa worked hard to get these clothes." She wouldn't even whip us in our dresses when we did something wrong. She made us take them off first. And Mama could really whip. If any grown-up told her that we'd been bad, we knew we were going to get it. Mama would march right out to those little black gum bushes growing in our yard, and she'd cut off a skinny branch and strip all the leaves off. And then she'd bring that switchback and she'd say, "Come on, young lady. We'd better not take too long getting there, either." But before she whipped us, she'd say, "Take that dress off. I ain't going to whip out these clothes your papa bought." Mama could whip, I'm telling you. She could get so mad. But she didn't ever get mad enough to forget about those clothes. Chores. We had the right much work to do. In the house and out in the garden, too. We planted and weeded, and dug up sweet potatoes, and picked butter beans. Papa let us sell the beans and keep the money for ourselves. We had to keep the yards clean, too, front and back. Most people didn't have grass in their yards. They had dirt yards, and we would sweep our yards every day, get up all the loose dirt, and leave them brushed clean, with the brush strokes the yard broom made looking almost like a design. My sister Mary and I did the cooking. Some weeks she cooked and some weeks I cooked. We had one of those big iron stoves that you put coal in to make a fire, and that stove would get so hot, not just on the cooking eyes, but all over. When we did the ironing, we'd set the irons on the stove to heat them up. Our irons were heavy, they were made of real iron, even the handles, and we had to use a thick piece of cloth to hold them. We had 4 or 5 irons, and we'd iron with one until it got too cool, and then we'd pick up another one, and keep on like that until we got the ironing done. We had feather beds. The mattresses were stuffed with chicken feathers, and we had to turn them over nearly every day, and we couldn't miss a day shaking them up and smoothing out all the lumps. They had to be exactly right, just as smooth and neat, or Mama would make us do them all over again. We didn't pull our bedspreads all the way up over the pillows the way a lot of people do nowadays. We had pillow shams that Mama had made, white cotton material that she cut in the shape of the pillow and embroidered. Sometimes she put lace around the edges, and she kept them starched so stiff and ironed so pretty. We would tack the top of the sham onto the head of the bedstead with thumbtacks, and after we finished making up the rest of the bed, we'd stand the pillows up and let the shams hang down in front of them. It was a pretty sight. Then at night when we went to bed, we'd fold the shams back over the head of the bedstead so they wouldn't get wrinkled. When you finished making up a bed, you knew better than to sit on it. Wherever you sat, those chicken feathers would mash flat and they'd stay mashed, and then you'd have to take everything off and start all over, shaking and patting to get it right again. We wouldn't ever sit on the bed. We already had enough chores to do, we sure didn't want to do anything twice. School. The school we went to was a one-room schoolhouse, a little square building with a big old pot-bellied stove inside. In the winter, the boys used to take turns going to school early in the morning to start the fire in the stove. That fire would be just blazing when the rest of us got there, and the room would be so warm. Our seats were long benches, and we didn't have desks. We wrote on slates in our laps with a little piece of chalk. Mr. Highsmith, that was our teacher, he used to walk up and down between the benches, smiling, while we studied our books. Spelling books, reading books, arithmetic books. We had to study. We'd be some kind of glad when 12 o'clock came and we could go out for recess. Most of the time we played in the schoolyard, but sometimes when the weather was nice and warm, we'd walk a ways from the school to a road where there were all these mulberry trees with ripe mulberries just waiting to be picked. We'd find some light wood knots, those little pieces of pine wood you see lying in the woods sometimes, and we'd throw them up as the branches to knock the berries down. We had the best at old-time eating and getting our faces and hands all purple and sticky. When recess was over, Mr. Highsmith would ring this little bell like the one Mama rang for us to come in to dinner. But if we were right in the schoolyard, he wouldn't ring the bell. He'd come to the schoolhouse door and call, "Books." He meant it was time for us to get back to those books and study some more. John and the Snake. A terrible thing happened to my brother John in the schoolyard one day. He and his friends were running and playing in the deep grass, and John said to his friends, "I bet you can't throw me down." Well, they jumped on him and threw him down, and they were holding him down, and they were holding him down there, and all of a sudden he felt this sharp pain in his wrist. John said, "Get off me. Somebody stuck me with pin." They said, "No, we didn't," but John felt it again. Then one of the boys saw this old snake wriggling through the grass, trying to get away. It was one of those poisonous snakes, too, a moccasin, and the boys ran after it and killed it with some sticks. Then they rushed John into school to tell Mr. Highsmith. Mr. Highsmith took his handkerchief and tied it tight around John's arm, right up above his elbow, so the poison wouldn't go to his heart, and he chewed some tobacco and laid it to John's wrist. Then John and some of his friends went to the mill to get Papa. Papa was so worried. He did everything he could think of to do. First, he put some alcohol on it, then somebody told him to cut open a black chicken and put that with, so he did that as soon as they got home. Then he went out in the country and got the snake doctor. That snake doctor knew what he was doing all right. He put this special kind of tea on the stove to brew, and he sent my sister Mary to the store to get 3 plugs of tobacco to cut up in it, and as soon as it was ready, he gave a cup of it to John. Well, that tea didn't stay in his stomach a hot minute. It came right back up, and it was as yellow as the yellow of an egg. Mama turned her head away, and she said, "Oh mister, you ain't doing my child a bit of good," but the doctor gave John another cup and the same thing happened. We waited for the 3rd cup to come back up too, but it didn't, so the doctor said all the poison was out of John's body. I looked at my brother lying in that bed and I just knew he was going to die. He looked so weak and sick, and his hand had swelled up so it looked like his fingers were about to split open. We sat up with him all night, all of us, his friends, too. The room was full of school children trying to stay awake and watch John, and in the morning he was better. That doctor had sure known what he was doing. John stayed in bed for about a week, and he had to sit around the house for 2 or 3 more weeks, then he was well enough to go back to school. But you could still see the print of those 2 holes on his wrist where the snake had punched its fangs in. All the children wanted to get a look at them, and John didn't mind a bit showing them off. Getting baptized. When we moved to Parmalee, right after Papa got his job feeding horses at the lumber mill, there wasn't a single place of worship in the town. So Mama used to go back to Robersonville to the Baptist church there, once a month, Saturday and Sunday. But finally, Mama and Papa got some people together to start holding church meetings in a vacant house. At first, they called the church the Parmalee Missionary Baptist Church. Then, they raised enough money to buy land and build their own building, and it was named Ridley's Chapel in honor of Mama and Papa. Later on, they changed it to Olive Branch Baptist Church, and that church is still there, not the same building but the one they put up after the old one burned down. I was baptized at Olive Branch, baptized in deep water when I was 12 years old. John and I, and a lot of other people. The day before the baptism, one of the deacons went down to the creek that was way out from the church, and he took this long pole with him to poke around in the water and see how deep it was, and to find any holes that might be dangerous. Then he left the pole standing in the water, and that was as far out as anybody was supposed to go. The next morning Mama and Papa took us to church, and everybody who was getting baptized wrapped a white cloth around their heads, and all the women and girls put on white gowns. We got in line and walked to the creek with the whole congregation going along with us. And everybody was just singing, "Take me to the water, take me to the water, take me to the water," to be baptized. And the deacon was taking people, one by one, down into the water so Reverend Riddick could baptize them and send them back up on the bank. When it came to my turn, I stepped into the water and it was cold, and my heart was just pounding, but I went on out to Reverend Riddick. He took my left hand and put it on my chest, and he put my right hand on top of my left hand. Then he leaned me backward toward the water, all the while talking, saying, "I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost." Then he dipped my head down under the water real fast and stood me right straight up again. He said, "Amen," and he put his hand on my forehead and wiped down my face kind of hard and fast so I wouldn't breathe in any water, and it was all over. I was baptized. Candy. We used to have parties we called candy crackings. I remember the very first one Papa had for us. He and Mr. Slade Barnhill bought a lot of hard candy and a new tin cup. They cracked the candy up into small pieces and put it in little bags and put the bags in the tub. Then they hung up this sheet for a curtain and set the rub behind it, and after we had played post office and pinned the tail on the donkey, we played fishing. The fishing pole was a reed with a string tied to it. We'd stick the fishing pole behind the curtain and somebody back there, Papa or Mr. Slade, would tie a bag of candy to it, and we'd pull it back. We had right much fun doing that, pretending we had caught a bag of candy. Sometimes we had candy pullings. We'd put sugar and a little vinegar in a brass kettle and set it on the stove, and as soon as the sugar got hot the vinegar would dissolve it. Then we cooked it until it hardened some, just a little, not too much, and we'd pour it in a batter that had been greased with butter. When the candy cooled enough, two of us would put butter on our hands and we'd pick up the candy, one of us at one end and one at the other, and we'd pull it, kind of easy like. When we started pulling, it would be brown, but after we had stretched it enough, it looked right silvery. Then we'd lay it all around on the platter and break it into sticks. It used to look so pretty, I almost didn't want to eat it. The Jones family. When I was about 14, Mr. and Mrs. Jones moved to Parmalee. Edmund and Eliza Knight Jones and their 10 children. There were 3 sons and 7 daughters. The Jones family bought 2 acres of land not far from our house, and they had a 1.5-story house built on it. 2 large rooms and a hall were on the first floor, and the second floor was an attic with a real low ceiling. It was so low, a grown person couldn't stand up in it, so it was used for the boys to sleep in. Mrs. Jones loved to read. She used to teach school sometimes, and she loved books. She wanted all of her children to be able to read, so she taught the big ones and the big ones taught the little ones. Mrs. Jones used to sell chicken eggs for 10 cents a dozen to buy books for her children. A book cost 15 cents, and that was a lot of money back then. One day there was a big windstorm in Parmalee, and I mean that was some storm. It blew the Jones house over. Nobody got hurt, but Mrs. Jones and 2 of her daughters had to go to work to save money for a new house. They went to Greenville and worked in the tobacco factory, pulling the stems off the tobacco leaves, until they had enough money. The family did most all the work on the new house themselves. They couldn't afford to buy nails, and their fingers bled from pulling the nails out of the old house to use again. My favorite person in the Jones family was William, the oldest one of their children. When I got old enough to have a fella, William was my fella. We went to church together and sang in the choir together. And Sunday evenings, Mama would let us go for a walk down to the train station to watch the trains come in and see the people passing through town. I was old enough to wear long dresses by then, and I would get all prettied up on a Sunday, and William would come and get me. My little sisters, Mary and Leah, always wanted to go with us on our walks. They kept begging and begging until one day I told them to come on and go. So William and first were walking along kind of slow, and I was holding the back of my dress with one hand the way I'd seen the ladies do, lifting it up just the tiniest little bit. Well, I happened to look back, and what were Mary and Leah doing but just switching along, holding the backs of their dresses, mocking me and giggling to beat the band. Well, the Jones families were our neighbors for a good long while. My brother John married Roberta, one of the daughters, and on December 30th, 1903, William Jones and first got married. Leah's wedding. When Leah was almost 17, she fell in love with Tom Moore, and they were married on a Wednesday night in September 1902. It was the first wedding ever held at Olive Branch Baptist Church. Leah wore a wreath on her head and white elbow gloves and a long dress trimmed in white silk ribbon. My sister was a beautiful bride. There were 6 bridesmaids, and I can't remember now just who they were, but I was the maid of honor. Reverend Gilmore was our preacher at that time, and Tom stood up front with him, while we walked in slow, without any music or anything. First the bridesmaids, then me, then Leah on Papa's arm. It was a real quiet, pretty wedding. After that, we went on back to our house for the reception, and the next morning the newlyweds left to go live in Portsmouth, Virginia. A lot of us went down to the train station to see them off. They were so happy and so much in love, and we couldn't keep from crying when the train pulled out. Tom and Leah hardly had time to get settled in their new home. One morning, about 3 weeks after the wedding, Tom left for work and he never came back. He had a job on a train that carried logs from Portsmouth to someplace in North Carolina, and that morning the train stopped at some little town, and Tom got off and was walking along the railroad tracks when the wire that fastened the logs to the train broke. It happened so fast that Tom didn't have a chance to get out of the way. All those logs rolled on top of him, and he was killed. So Leah came home a widow, all dressed in black, and she wasn't quite 17 years old. Well, William and I had the second wedding held at our church. After we were married, we stayed with his family for a while until he could finish the house he had started building, and then we went to live in our own 3-room house. William and I had 6 children. 4 of them lived to grow up. 4 daughters. One of them was Leslie.